Neighbor mocked his old uniform, then saw the Purple Heart, and froze the first time Gary Holbrook laughed at him. Daniel Reyes said nothing at all. He just stood there in his driveway, holding a paper plate with a hot dog going cold on it, while the whole cul-de-sac watched Gary hold up the old field jacket like it was a Halloween costume he'd found in somebody's attic. Faded, patched at the elbow, a name tape gone soft and gray from 100 washes. Gary turned it over in his hands like he was appraising something at a yard sale, and then he grinned at the crowd of neighbors gathered around the grill smoke and the folding tables, and he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear it, "What is this, man? You play dress-up on weekends?" A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, because Gary Holbrook laughed first, and laughing along with Gary Holbrook was easier than not. Daniel didn't answer. He set the paper plate down on the tailgate of his truck, walked over, and took the jacket out of Gary's hands, gently, the way you'd take something fragile away from a kid who didn't know what he was holding. He folded it over his arm. He said, "Thanks for taking a look." And that was it. That was the whole exchange. Then he went and found his daughter in the crowd of kids running around the sprinkler at the end of the block, and he watched her for the rest of the afternoon like nothing had happened. But something had happened. It just wasn't the kind of something you could see yet. It would take a fire, a folded flag, and a box that hadn't been opened in front of another living soul in 3 years before this street understood exactly what it had been laughing at that afternoon. But that is getting ahead of the story, and Daniel Reyes was not, by nature or by training, a man who got ahead of anything. He believed in letting things unfold in their own time, in their own order, the same patient way he'd once been taught to clear a room or read a map in the dark, one careful step after another. Nothing rushed. Nothing skipped. This is the street where Daniel Reyes has lived for 6 years. A quiet, dead end lined with maple trees that turn orange too early every October. Houses close enough that you can hear your neighbor's screen door bang shut from your own kitchen. Daniel's is the one with the wheelchair ramp he built himself for old Mr. Ferris 3 doors down. The one with a single bike leaned against the porch rail because there's only one kid in that house who rides it. His daughter's name is Mia. She is 8 years old, and she draws tiny stars on the back of her left hand with a ballpoint pen almost every morning, a habit that started sometime after her mother died and that Daniel has never once tried to stop. Because some things a kid needs to hold on to, and a row of 5 uneven stars in blue ink is apparently one of them. The block party itself had started, that afternoon, as the same easy, unremarkable gathering it always was. Folding tables dragged out onto the Fergusons' front lawn, a borrowed grill sending up ribbons of smoke that drifted lazily over the fence line. A cooler of drinks that everyone contributed to and nobody kept track of. Kids ran shrieking through a sprinkler set up at the end of the driveway. Mrs. Danby had brought her infamous potato salad, the one everyone secretly dreaded and nobody ever had the heart to leave off their plate. Old Mr. Ferris sat in a lawn chair under the shade of his own maple tree, content just to watch the street he'd lived on for 40 years fill up with noise for an afternoon. Daniel had almost not come at all. Saturdays were precious, one of the only stretches of unclaimed time he and Mia had together, and there was a part of him, the same part that had never fully learned to relax in a crowd, that would have been perfectly happy to spend the afternoon in the backyard instead. But Mia had begged, and old Mr. Ferris had specifically asked if she'd help him build a scarecrow for his garden before the frost came, and so Daniel had gone, the old field jacket tossed over his arm because Mia insisted a scarecrow needed something that actually looked worn out, and for the first hour it had been a perfectly good afternoon. He'd talked with Tom, who lived 2 streets further down, and coached the same youth soccer league Mia had played in the spring before deciding she liked reading better. He'd let Mrs. Danby corner him for a full 10 minutes about a leak under her kitchen sink he'd already quietly promised to look at next weekend. He'd watched his daughter run through the sprinkler with Theo, laughing so hard she could barely breathe, and thought, the way he often thought at moments like that whatever else this life had cost him, it had also given him this, and that the trade, on its best days, felt almost fair. A typical morning at the Reyes house, on any other week of the year, goes like this. 5:40. The coffee maker gurgles to life before Daniel's alarm even finishes its first cycle, because he set it the night before, the same way he sets it every night, without fail. 5:50. He's standing at the counter in yesterday's t-shirt, mug in hand, looking out the kitchen window at a street that hasn't woken up yet. 6:15. Mia's door creaks open that particular creak. Third stair-step pitch. He's meant to oil it for 2 years and never has, and she pads down the hallway in socks with a hole starting in one heel, hair a wreck, already talking about whatever dream she just climbed out of. 6:30. Cereal. The same brand every time. Milk poured to a line only she can see. 6:40. The stars go on the back of her hand while she eats. Ballpoint pen kept in the kitchen junk drawer specifically for this purpose. Because the one time Daniel suggested she keep it in her backpack instead, she looked at him like he'd suggested she stop breathing. Some mornings go sideways. There was the Tuesday the toast caught fire in the toaster, because Daniel got distracted helping her hunt down a missing shoe, and the smoke alarm went off, and Mia laughed so hard about Dad, the fire alarm, for toast, that she was still bringing it up at dinner 2 weeks later. There was the morning he drove her to school still wearing one work boot and one house slipper, because he hadn't noticed in the dark, and she didn't tell him until they were already in the school pickup line, at which point she thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened to either of them. These are the mornings Daniel holds on to. Not because they're remarkable. Because they're not. Because ordinary, uneventful, slightly ridiculous mornings were the exact thing he used to lie awake overseas hoping he'd someday get to have, and now that he has them, he understands, in a way most people never have to learn, exactly how much they're worth. Daniel's wife, Claire, passed 3 years ago. Cancer. Fast and mean. The kind that gives you 6 months and takes 4 of them. Since then, it has been just the 2 of them in that house, Daniel and Mia, and a rhythm that took a long time to build, and that Daniel guards like it's made of glass. Coffee at 5:40 every morning, black in a chipped mug that says "World's Okayest Fisherman" that Claire bought him as a joke 11 years ago. Lunch packed the night before, because mornings are already too full. A drive-through order that never changes one plain cheeseburger. No pickles, apple juice, because that is what Mia has ordered since she was 4 years old, and Daniel has never once suggested she try something different. The first year after Claire died was the hardest thing Daniel had ever done, and he had done some genuinely hard things. There is no training for it, no drill anyone runs you through in advance, no sergeant barking instructions on how to braid a 6-year-old's hair for the first time, with hands that know how to field strip a rifle blind, but have never once touched a hair tie. He learned it anyway, the way he'd learned everything else in his life badly at first. Then, less badly. Then, eventually, well enough that Mia stopped wincing when he pulled the brush through in the mornings. He learned which cereal she'd eat and which one she'd only ever push around the bowl. He learned that Tuesday nights were library nights because Claire had started that tradition, and Mia would not, under any circumstances, let it die with her mother. He learned the sound of his daughter's laugh well enough that he could tell, from 2 rooms away, whether it was a real laugh or the performance one she used sometimes on adults she wasn't sure of yet. He remembers, more clearly than he'd like, the night he came home from the hospital without her. Mia had been staying with Rosa Alvarez, and when Daniel walked up the driveway alone, Rosa had met him on her porch, taken one look at his face, and simply held the screen door open without asking a single question. Mia was asleep on Rosa's couch under a quilt that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, and Daniel had stood over her for a long time before he could make himself wake her, because waking her meant saying the sentence out loud, and once he said it, it would be true in a way it hadn't quite been true yet. He built a small life for the two of them out of these details, the way you build anything that has to hold weight one careful piece at a time, tested before you trust it, reinforced where it needs reinforcing. The house stayed a little too clean, in the particular way houses stay clean when a man is trying to control the only thing that still feels controllable. The porch light got checked every single night, not just at his own house but at Rosa Alvarez's 2 doors down, because Claire used to worry about her living alone, and worrying about Rosa now felt like the last favor Daniel could still do for his wife. He never dated. He never really considered it. Some nights he sat on the back steps after Mia was asleep with a beer he'd nurse for an hour and let himself miss Claire in a private, unhurried way that nobody on that street ever saw. What none of the neighbors saw, either what none of them had any reason to see, was the other life folded up behind that quiet, tidy one. 2 tours. A rank he never mentioned. A unit that used to call him preacher. Not because he was religious, but because he was the one who always had something calm and steady to say when everyone else's nerves were shredded thin. He does not talk about either deployment, not because he's ashamed of them, but because there is no version of the story short enough for small talk, and no version of small talk built to hold a story that long. So when people ask, and people do ask, eventually, once they learn he served, he gives them 3 or 4 flat sentences and lets the conversation move on to something easier. And almost everyone lets it, grateful, in their own way, not to have to sit with whatever he might have said instead. Almost everyone. Not Gary Holbrook. He works as an vac technician now. Before that, he was an infantryman, and before that, a boy from a town smaller than this cul-de-sac who joined the army at 19 because there was nothing else in town worth staying for. He served 2 tours. He does not talk about either of them. Not to his co-workers, not to the guys at the hardware store, not to the other parents at Mia's school. Not even, most nights, to himself. The jacket that Gary Holbrook held up in front of the whole street that afternoon was the field jacket Daniel wore on his 2nd deployment. It still has sand in the seams if you look close enough, ground so deep into the fabric that no washing machine has ever gotten it all the way out. Daniel keeps it folded in a box on the top shelf of his closet, along with a few other things he doesn't take out very often. He'd only brought it to the block party because Mia had asked him to bring the old green jacket for a scarecrow she wanted to help old Mr. Ferris build for his garden, and Daniel, who could rarely say no to his daughter about anything small like that, had grabbed it without thinking twice. He should have thought twice. Gary Holbrook moved onto the street 4 months before that barbecue, into the big house on the corner with the immaculate lawn and the 2 SUVs in the driveway and the flag that flies a little too crisply, like it was bought more for the aesthetic than for anything it stands for. Gary is the kind of man who talks about being a patriot the way other men talk about their fantasy football league, loudly, constantly, and mostly to hear himself say it. He has opinions about the military that he picked up from documentaries and internet arguments. He has never served a day in his life. What he has is a booming laugh, a way of taking up space in every conversation, and an instinct, sharp as a hunting dog's, for finding the quiet man in every room and deciding that quiet means weak. He decided that about Daniel almost immediately. It wasn't malicious, not at first. It was just Gary being Gary, the loud jokes at Daniel's expense about his vintage truck, about the way he mowed his lawn in perfectly straight lines like he's still taking orders, about how he never joined in when the men on the street gathered for Sunday football and beer. Daniel let most of it slide off him. He had bigger things to think about: Mia's second-grade reading log, a leaking water heater in the Alvarez house that he'd promised to look at for free, the ache in his left knee that flared up every time the weather turned, an old injury he never explained to anyone. Gary had a way of narrating his own life that Daniel found at first almost funny in how transparent it was. He'd stand at the end of his driveway with a travel mug of coffee, watching the street wake up, and offer opinions on everything: the school board, the price of gas, a war on the other side of the world he'd only ever seen through a phone screen, with the total, unshakable confidence of a man who had never once had to live inside the consequences of being wrong. He liked telling people he respected the hell out of our troops. He said it often, usually right before or right after making fun of something he didn't understand about the one actual veteran living 40 feet from his front door. What nobody on the street knew about Gary Holbrook, what he would never have volunteered at a barbecue, no matter how many drinks he'd had, was that his own father had served, briefly decades ago, and had come home from it a harder, more distant man than the one who'd left. Gary had spent a childhood trying to get that man's attention through achievement, through noise, through exactly the kind of loud, confident performance he still put on every single day of his adult life, and had never once succeeded. His father died when Gary was 26, having said maybe a few hundred words to him in the last decade of his life, most of them about lawn maintenance. Gary had built an entire personality, without ever fully realizing it, out of trying to become the kind of man his father might have finally been proud of: a man who talked easily, who filled silences instead of disappearing into them, who never ever let a room go quiet the way his father used to let rooms go quiet for days at a stretch. Daniel's silence, in other words, hit something in Gary that had nothing at all to do with Daniel. It looked, to Gary, uncomfortably like his father's silence: the same closed door, the same withheld story, the same sense of a man who had access to some deeper room that Gary had spent his whole life being kept out of. He didn't understand any of that about himself. Not yet. And so instead of sitting with the discomfort, he did what he'd always done with discomfort. He made it into a joke, turned it outward, made himself the loud one in the room so nobody would notice how much the quiet one unsettled him. None of that excused what came next. Daniel would say so himself, later, when he finally learned some of it. But it explained a little of the why, and understanding the why, even without excusing it, would eventually turn out to matter. The two of them had exactly one real conversation before the barbecue, back in June, not long after the Holbrooks moved in. Gary had wandered over while Daniel was replacing a fence post, propped one boot up on the low wall, and asked, in the breezy tone of a man expecting a good story, "So what was it like, actually? Over there?" Daniel had kept working, hammer in hand, and given him the 4 flat sentences he gave everyone. 2 tours. Infantry. Doesn't really talk about specifics. Glad to be home with his daughter now. Gary had waited a beat, clearly disappointed, the way a man is disappointed when a movie doesn't deliver the ending he was promised. "Huh," he'd said. "I figured a guy like you would have some stories." And then he'd wandered back to his own yard, and something in the way he said it, "a guy like you," settled into Daniel's chest and stayed there. A small, cold seed that would not fully bloom into anything until 3 months later, in front of the whole street, with a paper plate of cooling hot dogs in his hand. But the jacket was different. The jacket was the first time Gary had reached past the surface jokes and put his hands, literally, on something that mattered. Daniel didn't say anything that day, and in some ways, that was the beginning of the problem. Because in a place like this street, silence gets filled in by other people's imaginations, and Gary Holbrook's imagination, once given an inch, would take the rest of the summer. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment here. A raised eyebrow there. Gary began telling people, in that easy, confident, half-joking tone of his, that something was off about the quiet guy at the end of the street. That he'd heard shouting from Daniel's house late one night, which was true, though not in the way Gary made it sound. That a man who wouldn't talk about himself probably had something to hide. That maybe a single father living alone with a little girl, keeping to himself, keeping old army gear folded up in his closet like some kind of shrine, was exactly the sort of person a neighborhood ought to keep an eye on. None of it was said with real venom. That was the insidious part. It was said with a shrug, a laugh, I'm just saying. You know? The kind of talk that spreads through a cul-de-sac like water finding the cracks in a driveway. Quiet, patient, and impossible to stop once it started. The night Gary was talking about the shouting had happened 3 weeks earlier. Mia had been asleep in her room, and Daniel had been asleep in his, and somewhere in the dark hours past 2 in the morning, something in his sleep had pulled him back to a road outside a town whose name he has never once said out loud since he came home. He woke himself up shouting a name that wasn't his daughter's, drenched in sweat, heart slamming against his ribs so hard it hurt to breathe. And before he'd even fully understood where he was, before the bedroom walls had resolved themselves back into bedroom walls, his door had creaked open, and there was Mia, 8 years old, in her pajamas with the faded cartoon fish on them, standing in the doorway with her hand already reaching for the light switch. "It's the bad dream again," she'd said, not scared, not even really surprised, in the calm and practiced voice of a kid who has done this before. "Do you want water? Or do you want me to sit with you?" That was the sound the neighbors heard. Not a man losing control of himself, a man surfacing from something old and terrible, and a little girl who loved him enough to already know exactly what to do about it. Gary Holbrook did not know any of that. Gary Holbrook heard a man yell in the night and decided, without ever asking a single question, that he had the whole story. By the end of that summer, the whispers had done what whispers do. A few of the other parents on the street started keeping their kids a little closer to home when Daniel walked by. Mrs. Danby, 2 doors down, stopped waving from her porch the way she used to. At back-to-school night, when Daniel showed up in his one good collared shirt, hair still damp from a shower he'd rushed to take after a late service call, he noticed the way conversations near him seemed to pause, then pick back up in a lower register once he'd passed. Nobody said anything to his face. Nobody ever does, in places like this. It's all sideways glances and softened voices and invitations that quietly stop coming. Mia noticed before Daniel let himself admit it out loud. She came home from a birthday party 2 houses down, looking smaller than she had that morning, and when Daniel asked how it was, she just shrugged and said, "Kayla's mom kept looking at me weird when I said Daddy was picking me up." She didn't cry. She didn't make a thing of it. She just carried it, the way kids sometimes carry things they don't have words for yet, and Daniel carried it right along with her, silently, the way he carried everything. It bled into other corners of his life, too, the way these things always do once they're given enough room to spread. A regular customer on his vac route, a man named Phil Osgood, whose furnace Daniel had serviced twice a year for 3 straight years without a single complaint, called the company office that September and asked, awkwardly, whether they had anyone else available. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. Daniel's supervisor, a decent man named Tom who liked Daniel well enough not to ask too many questions, mentioned it to him almost apologetically, and Daniel had simply nodded, said he understood, and gone on to his next call, because there was nothing else to be done with information like that, except carry it quietly, along with everything else. Tom, his supervisor, never mentioned the Osgood call directly in the weeks that followed, but Daniel noticed, in the small, undramatic way you notice things from people who care without making a production of it, that Tom had started routing a few of the friendlier repeat customers his way instead, the ones less likely to have heard anything through the neighborhood grapevine, and had twice found small, unnecessary reasons to stop by a job site Daniel was working just to check in, ask how Mia was doing, stay for a cup of coffee out of a thermos before heading back to the office. He never once asked Daniel to explain himself. He simply made it a little easier for a hard season to pass, the way a decent boss sometimes can without ever needing to say so out loud, and Daniel, who noticed everything, noticed that too, and was grateful for it in a way he never quite found the words to express directly. At school, it took a subtler shape. Mia's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Whitfield, was a careful, well-meaning woman who had heard, second-hand through the parent grapevine, that there was some concern about the home situation at the Reyes house. She never said anything to Daniel directly that wasn't how it worked, not in a school system that prized documentation and process over conversation, but she began, without quite meaning to, watching Mia a little more closely than the other kids, asking her a few too many gentle questions about how things were at home. Making a note, once, when Mia showed up to school with mismatched socks and slightly tangled hair on a morning when Daniel had gotten an emergency call at 4 a.m. and simply run out of time before the bus came. None of it, on its own, amounted to much, but Daniel could feel the shape of it building around him and his daughter, brick by brick. The same slow, patient construction he'd watched Gary Holbrook start at that barbecue. And there was nothing he could point to directly, nothing he could stand up and object to, because it was all just glances and softened voices and a phone call that used the word concern instead of ever saying what it actually meant. It reached Mia directly for the first time on a Wednesday in mid-September at recess, when a boy 2 grades up one of Gary Holbrook's older nephews, visiting for the week and picking up gossip the way kids that age always do, faster and more carelessly than any adult realizes, cornered her near the monkey bars and asked her, with the particular cruelty only a 10-year-old can manage without fully understanding its weight, whether it was true that her dad went crazy at night and whether that was why her mom had left. Mia didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of him. She told Daniel later that she'd said her mom didn't leave. Her mom died, and that her dad wasn't crazy, he just had bad dreams sometimes. The same words she'd have used to explain a stomachache or a broken arm, plain and unashamed, because in her house that was simply what it was. But she came home that day quieter than usual, and it was only after dinner when Daniel found her sitting on her bedroom floor drawing furious scribbled stars all over a piece of paper instead of just on the back of her hand, that the whole story came out of her in a rush, half proud of how she'd handled it, and half devastated that she'd had to handle it at all. Daniel sat down on the floor next to her, said nothing for a long moment, and then told her as plainly as she'd told the boy off that she'd said exactly the right thing, every word of it, and that some people needed a little more time and a little more information before they stopped being scared of things they didn't understand. It was, though he didn't say this part out loud to an 8-year-old, more or less the same speech Dr. Okafor had been trying to give him for a year. He called the school the next morning, calm and measured, and asked to speak with the boy's teacher not to punish a kid who'd clearly only been repeating what he'd heard at home, but to make sure the adult in that classroom understood exactly what kind of talk had made its way onto a school playground. The teacher, mortified, promised to handle it. Daniel never found out whether Gary himself ever learned that his nephew had carried his backyard commentary directly to an 8-year-old girl at recess, and it was probably better, in the end, that he didn't have to find out that way. There was a Tuesday in late September when Daniel very nearly broke his own rule of silence, and it happened, of all places, in the checkout line at the hardware store. Gary was 2 people ahead of him, loudly recounting to the cashier some exaggerated story about a neighbor's issues, clearly not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that the subject of the story was standing close enough to hear every word. Daniel felt the old cold anger rise up fast and sharp, the same anger he'd learned, a long time ago, to recognize as dangerous precisely because of how clean and righteous it always felt in the moment. His hands actually flexed at his sides, and for 3 or 4 full seconds, he let himself imagine exactly what he could say. Exactly how satisfying it would feel to say it. Exactly how quickly he could strip the smugness out of Gary Holbrook's voice with 4 or 5 well-chosen sentences. He didn't do it. He set his items down on the belt instead, paid, and walked out into the parking lot, where he sat in his truck for a full minute with both hands on the wheel before he trusted himself enough to drive. It wasn't fear that stopped him. It was something closer to arithmetic, the plain, practical calculation of a man who had learned, in places far more dangerous than a hardware store parking lot, that the cost of losing control rarely fell only on the person who lost it. He thought of Mia, waiting for him at home with her reading log spread out on the kitchen table, and decided that whatever satisfaction a confrontation might buy him wasn't worth what it might cost her. He never told anyone about that afternoon, not even Dr. Okafor, not really. It became, quietly, one more thing folded into the box he carried without setting down, and it would be another month before he finally set even a small piece of that box down in front of somebody else. The lowest point before the police car came on a Thursday afternoon in early September, at pickup, when Daniel arrived in his work uniform, grease still under his fingernails from a job that had run long, and found himself standing at the edge of the pickup circle while 3 other fathers stood in a loose, easy cluster a few feet away, talking about a fantasy football draft. He said hello. 2 of them nodded back, polite but brief. The third, a man Daniel had never had a single problem with before that summer, found something urgent to check on his phone and didn't look up at all. Daniel stood there in the September heat, waiting for his daughter's class to be dismissed, and felt something in his chest go very quiet, and very still not angry. Not yet. Just tired. The particular exhaustion of a man who has spent his whole adult life being underestimated in one direction or another. First by people who assumed a quiet soldier had nothing worth hearing, and now by people who assumed a quiet single father had something worth hiding. When Mia came running out of the building a few minutes later, backpack bouncing, ballpoint stars fresh on the back of her hand, she threw her arms around his waist the way she always did. And for just a second, standing there in a schoolyard full of parents who had quietly decided he was someone to be wary of, that was enough to hold him together. Not every kid on that street had absorbed their parents' unease, though, and the one who hadn't turned out to matter more than Daniel could have guessed. A boy named Theo, from 2 streets over, had been Mia's closest friend since kindergarten. The 2 of them bonded over a shared, fierce love of a cartoon about a dog detective that neither of them would admit they were getting a little old for. Theo's mother had been among the quieter voices at that park bench conversation, uneasy enough to nod along with Gary but never quite willing to say the ugly parts out loud, and in the weeks after. She'd made a few halting attempts to keep some distance between the two kids, a playdate that mysteriously never got rescheduled, a birthday party invitation that arrived a full week later than everyone else's. Theo didn't understand any of it, and didn't particularly try to. He showed up at Mia's front door on a Saturday afternoon in late September, uninvited, bike dropped sideways in the yard, and asked if she wanted to come look for frogs by the drainage ditch at the end of the block, exactly the way he had every other Saturday that summer. When his mother found out, flustered, and tried gently to redirect him toward a different friend for the afternoon, Theo had looked at her with the particular, uncomplicated logic of an 8-year-old, and said, "Why, Mia's my best friend," and that had apparently been the end of the discussion, because there is a kind of loyalty in children that adults spend their whole lives trying and mostly failing to relearn. Daniel never knew the full shape of what Theo's mother had almost done, not until much later, and when he did learn it, secondhand, from Rosa, he found he wasn't angry about it at all. Mostly he was grateful, fiercely, quietly grateful that his daughter had one person on that street whose loyalty had never once wavered, small and stubborn and entirely his own, while the grown-ups around them spent a whole season deciding whether or not her father could be trusted. He thought about explaining. He thought about it more than once, standing in his own kitchen at midnight with the water running longer than it needed to, rehearsing words he never said out loud. He thought about walking over to Gary's pristine lawn and telling him exactly what that jacket meant, exactly what 2 tours overseas had cost him, exactly what kind of sound a person makes when the worst night of his life plays itself back in a dream he can't wake up from fast enough. But there was a wall in Daniel that had been built a long time ago, brick by brick, out of every well-meaning question he'd ever gotten wrong footing on what was it like over there. Did you ever have to know and the careful, closed-off answers he'd learned to give instead? It is easier, most days, to let people believe whatever story fills the silence than to hand them the real one and watch their face try to figure out what to do with it. So, he said nothing, and the story that filled the silence kept getting worse. There is a small park at the mouth of the cul-de-sac, barely more than a strip of grass with 2 benches and a maple tree old enough to have outlived 3 generations of kids on bicycles. It was there, on a Tuesday evening in late September, that the Whisper campaign finally crossed into something, with teeth. Gary Holbrook had organized what he called a neighborhood safety chat, nothing official, nothing with a name or a sign-up sheet, just a handful of parents gathered around one of the benches after the kids had gone inside for dinner. Daniel wasn't there. He was 2 streets over, kneeling in Mrs. Alvarez's garage with a flashlight in his teeth, replacing a water heater valve he'd promised her he'd fix weeks ago, refusing, as always, to take a dime for it. Rosa's garage that evening smelled like it always did, motor oil and dust, and the particular mustiness of a space that had held 40 years of one family's accumulated life. She sat on an overturned bucket a few feet away while Daniel worked, the way she often did, keeping him company more than actually supervising, and told him, apropos of nothing, about a garden she and Roberto used to keep in the backyard before her knees got too bad to manage it, tomatoes mostly, and a stubborn patch of mint that had tried to take over the whole yard until Roberto finally gave up fighting it and let it win. Daniel listened with half his attention on the valve in front of him and half on her, the way he always did with Rosa, because her stories, unhurried and specific, were one of the few things that reliably quieted whatever noise was running in the back of his own head that week. "You're good at this," she told him, watching him work the wrench with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. "The fixing. You never make a big show of it. You just do it, and it's done." "Not much point making a show of a water heater," Daniel said, not looking up. "No," Rosa agreed. "There isn't." She said it in a tone that made him glance over at her, briefly, wondering if she meant something else by it, but she'd already moved on to asking whether Mia still liked the tomatoes from her garden. And the moment passed, the way most moments with Rosa passed gently, without insisting on being noticed. He didn't know, that evening, that Gary was standing in the fading light, telling the other parents that maybe it was time somebody looked into the situation at the end of the street. That a man who wouldn't talk about his past, who kept boxes of military gear in his closet, who'd been overheard shouting in the night, might not be the kind of neighbor you wanted your kids walking past unsupervised. He didn't use the word dangerous. He didn't have to. He just left it hanging there, in the space between sentences, the way he'd learned to leave everything hanging and let the other parents fill it in themselves. One of them, a soft-spoken woman named Renee, who lived 2 doors from Daniel and had 2 boys close to Mia's age, actually called the non-emergency police line that night. Not out of malice, she would say later, red-faced with embarrassment, that she genuinely believed she was doing the responsible thing, but out of the exact kind of fear Gary had spent all summer, one comment at a time, planting in her. A patrol car pulled up outside Daniel's house at 8:15 that evening. Mia was at the kitchen table doing homework, a math worksheet with a smiley face sticker already earned in the corner, and Daniel was standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in his hand when the knock came. He remembers, with a clarity he wishes he didn't have, the exact look on his daughter's face when she saw the uniform on the officer standing on their front porch, not fear of the officer, but a flash of something else entirely, a question in her eyes, aimed straight at her father. Did I do something wrong? Did you? The officer was polite. Professional, he explained there'd been a call about a possible disturbance, and Daniel, keeping his voice level for Mia's sake even as something cold and furious moved through his chest, answered every question calmly. Yes, he was a veteran. Yes, sometimes he had nightmares. No, there had never been any danger to anyone in this house, least of all his daughter. The officer, to his credit, seemed to understand within about 90 seconds that he'd been sent to the wrong kind of call entirely, and he glanced past Daniel's shoulder at one point, toward the kitchen table where Mia sat frozen with her pencil still in her hand, and something in his own face softened. He crouched down slightly before he left and told her directly that everything was fine, that her dad hadn't done anything wrong, that sometimes grown-ups make phone calls about things they don't fully understand. It was a kindness Daniel hadn't expected and was grateful for regardless, though it did nothing to undo the fact that a police car had just sat outside Daniel Reyes's house in full view of every window on the street, with his 8-year-old daughter watching from the kitchen table. Mia didn't say much that night. She ate her dinner. She let Daniel tuck her in. But when he turned off her light, she said, into the dark, in a small voice that he has never fully forgiven the street for putting there, "Are we going to have to move, Daddy?" He told her no. He told her they weren't going anywhere. He sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing evened out into sleep, and then he went and sat alone at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling something in him that had survived 2 deployments start to genuinely crack. He thought, sitting there in the quiet, about all the times overseas he'd told himself that the hardest part of the job was staying alive, and how wrong that had turned out to be. The hardest part, it turned out, was coming home and discovering that the world you'd fought to get back to could still find new ways to make you feel like the danger, instead of the man who'd once run toward danger so other people wouldn't have to. He didn't cry that night, not exactly, but he came closer to it than he had, in longer than he could remember, sitting alone in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the dinner he'd made for his daughter an hour earlier. It would have been easy, in that moment, to let the anger win. To march over to Gary Holbrook's pristine lawn and let years of restraint go up in one loud, satisfying confrontation. But Daniel Reyes had learned a long time ago, in places far worse than this cul-de-sac, that the man who loses control first is very often the man who loses the whole fight. So instead, he did what he always did. He got up the next morning at 5:40, made his coffee, packed Mia's lunch, and drove her to school like it was any other day. Because that is what you do for the people who depend on you, even when the ground underneath you feels like it's shifting. That Saturday, though, he did something he hadn't done in almost a year. He called the VA counselor he'd stopped seeing regularly not long after Claire passed, when grief and old wounds had briefly tangled together into something too heavy to carry alone, and he sat in the parking lot of a strip mall clinic for 20 minutes before he made himself walk inside. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Okafor, who had heard some version of this story from 100 different men before him, listened to the whole thing: the jacket, the whispers, the police car, his daughter's small voice asking if they'd have to move without once telling him what he should feel about any of it. "How's Mia handling it?" she asked, when he'd finished. "Better than she should have to," Daniel said. "She shouldn't have to handle any of it. She's 8. "No, she shouldn't," Dr. Okafor agreed. "But she's watching you handle it too, whether you mean for her to or not. Kids learn more from what we do with a hard thing than from anything we ever tell them about it." Daniel turned that over for a moment, looking at a spot on the wall just past her shoulder, the way he always did in that office, when a sentence landed somewhere he didn't want it to land. "So what am I teaching her right now? Keep your head down and let people believe whatever they want?" "That's one option," Okafor said, without judgment, the way she said most things. "It's not the only one you have. You've been protecting your privacy for a long time, Daniel, and that instinct kept you steady for a long time too. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was wrong. But protecting your privacy and protecting your daughter used to be the same thing. Right now, on this street, they might not be anymore. You know, none of this is about who you actually are," she added, near the end. "It's about what's easy for people to believe when you don't give them anything else to work with." "I know that," Daniel said. "Do you want to give them something else to work with?" He didn't answer that right away. He thought about it the whole drive home, past the maple trees just starting to think about turning, past Gary Holbrook's pristine lawn with its flag flying a little too crisply. And he still didn't have an answer by the time he pulled into his own driveway and found Mia sitting on the front steps waiting for him, swinging her legs, a library book open on her lap. "How was your appointment?" she asked, because she was 8 and she had learned, the way kids of veterans sometimes learn far too early, that appointments were simply a normal part of some Saturdays. Nothing to make a fuss about. "Good," Daniel said, and sat down beside her on the step. Real good, actually. He still didn't have his answer. It would take a burning car in a driveway to give him one for free. What Daniel didn't know, what nobody on that street knew, save for one person, was that Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly widow whose water heater he'd fixed for free, whose porch light he checked every single night before he went to bed just to make sure the bulb hadn't burned out on a woman who lived alone, had quietly begun paying much closer attention than anyone realized. Rosa Alvarez was 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and she had buried a husband who'd served in Vietnam, a man who used to wake in the night the exact same way Daniel did, who used to go quiet in the exact same way Daniel did whenever someone asked him too many questions about a war he'd never wanted to discuss. She recognized the shape of Daniel's silence the very first week he moved to the street, though she'd never once said so to him directly, because she understood, better than anyone else on that block, that some doors are not meant to be pushed open. They're meant to be waited beside, patiently, until the man on the other side decides for himself that it's time. Rosa had married Roberto Alvarez in 1971, 3 years after he came home from a war that had by then already stopped being popular with the country that sent him. He'd come home quieter than the boy she'd fallen for at 19, prone to sudden silences at the dinner table, and nights where she'd wake to find his side of the bed empty, and him sitting in the dark kitchen with all the lights off, staring at nothing. She had spent the first decade of their marriage hurt by it, certain, in the particular way young wives are sometimes certain of the wrong things, that his silence meant she wasn't enough to reach him. It had taken her years, and eventually a support group for military spouses that met in a church basement on Wednesday nights, to understand that his silence had never been about her at all, that some men come home carrying things too heavy to set down in front of the people they love most, precisely because they love them too much to make them carry it too. Roberto passed 11 years ago, and Rosa still keeps his reading glasses in the drawer of the nightstand on what used to be his side of the bed, though she couldn't have said exactly why if you'd asked her. When Daniel Reyes moved onto the street 6 years ago, quiet and careful, and clearly carrying something he wasn't naming, Rosa had recognized the shape of him within about a week. The way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in a long time but never quite forget. She had watched the Whisper campaign build all summer with a slow, simmering anger she kept mostly to herself. She had heard Gary Holbrook's jokes at the block party. She had heard, secondhand, about the police car outside Daniel's house, and it had kept her up half that night, furious in a way her late husband would have recognized instantly. But Rosa Alvarez was not a woman who confronted people loudly. She was a woman who waited for the right moment and built her case quietly in the meantime, the same way she'd spent 40 years quietly building a marriage with a man the world had never bothered to understand either. There was a quiet evening in the middle of that stretch, a Sunday in late September, when Mia climbed into Daniel's lap on the couch after her bath, hair still damp, and asked him, out of nowhere, whether her mom would have believed the things people were saying about him. Daniel had gone very still for a moment, the question landing somewhere unguarded. And then, he'd told her the truth, because he had promised himself a long time ago that he would never lie to his daughter about the things that mattered. "No," he said. "Your mom knew exactly who I was. That's part of why she married me. Then why does everyone else believe it? Because your mom took the time to actually get to know me first," Daniel said. "Most people don't. It's easier to guess than it is to ask, so that's what most people do." He tucked a piece of damp hair behind her ear. "It doesn't mean they're right. It just means they're lazy, sometimes, even the nice ones." Mia had considered that for a while, tracing one finger absently along the faded stars still visible on the back of her other hand from that morning. "I'm not going to be lazy like that when I grow up," she finally said, with the flat, total certainty of an 8-year-old making a promise to herself, and Daniel had pulled her a little closer and told her he believed her completely, because in that moment, watching her, he did. The right moment arrived 3 weeks later, on a gray Saturday morning in October, in a way that none of them, not Daniel, not Gary, not Rosa, not the 8-year-old girl with stars drawn on the back of her hand could have predicted. Daniel had woken that Saturday the same way he woke most Saturdays, at 5:40, coffee in the chipped mug, the street outside his kitchen window still gray and sleeping. Mia had a soccer game of her own that morning, a rec league match she'd only reluctantly agreed to after Theo talked her into it, and Daniel had spent the first hour of daylight hunting down her shin guards, which had mysteriously relocated themselves to the back of the hall closet sometime in August and never quite made their way out again. He remembers standing in the driveway around 7:15, travel mug in hand, going over the morning schedule in his head game at 9, home by 11. A water heater part he still needed to pick up for Rosa before the hardware store got busy when he heard, from across the street, the particular high, panicked pitch of a sound no parent ever wants to hear from a neighbor's yard. It started with smoke, thin, gray, curling out from beneath the hood of the second SUV in Gary Holbrook's driveway at just past 7 in the morning, while Gary himself was 3 states away at a work conference, and his wife, Denise, was inside getting their youngest ready for a Saturday soccer game. She didn't notice the smoke until it had already thickened, until the acrid smell had crept in through the kitchen window she'd left cracked for the cool morning air, and by the time she ran outside in her socks, phone in hand, flames had already caught along the engine bay and were licking hungrily up toward the open hood. Her youngest son, 6 years old, had wandered out behind her, drawn by the commotion the way 6-year-olds always are, and was standing far closer to that burning vehicle than any adult would have allowed if any adult had been paying attention in that first chaotic minute. Daniel was in his own driveway when he heard Denise Holbrook scream. He didn't think. There wasn't time to think, and 11 years of training had never really been about thinking. Anyway, it had been about building instincts so deep into the body that thought became unnecessary, that the body simply moved correctly before the mind had finished catching up. Daniel was across the street and had the 6-year-old boy scooped up and moving backward, putting real distance between the child and the vehicle before Denise had even finished drawing the breath for her second scream. Get back, all the way to the sidewalk," Daniel said, voice flat and commanding in a way none of his neighbors had ever heard from him before, and Denise, shaking, obeyed instantly, the way people always obey a voice that clearly knows exactly what it's doing. He checked the boy over in 3 seconds flat, no burns, no injuries, just a scared kid crying into his mother's shoulder, and then he turned back to the fire, which had by now fully engulfed the engine and was starting to lick toward the cabin, toward the gas tank, toward a situation that in another 90 seconds would stop being a car fire and start being something far worse for every house on that street. He grabbed the garden hose coiled by his own porch, and though he absolutely knew that a garden hose wasn't going to put out an engine fire, what it could do, what it might just barely do, was slow it down, buy time, keep the fire from reaching the fuel line before the trucks arrived. He was already dialing 911 with one hand and dragging the hose across the street with the other, shouting instructions to Denise get the other kids further back. Is anyone else inside the house? Keep everyone on the far side of the yard with the exact calm, clipped urgency of a man who had done this kind of thing, or something enough like it, more times than he had ever wanted to. There is a particular kind of stillness that drops over a man in moments like that, one that Daniel had not felt in years, and that he would later be unable to fully describe to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves. The sound of the street seemed to fall away. Denise's crying, the crackle of the flames, the distant wail of the first responding siren still blocks away, and everything narrowed down to a series of small, clear, immediate decisions. Water on the parts of the engine bay not yet fully involved. Body positioned so the wind carried smoke away from the house, not toward it. A glance every few seconds toward Denise and her boys to make sure the perimeter was holding. It was the same narrowing he remembered from a road outside a town he doesn't name. The same clean, terrible focus that had once kept him alive and had, on one particular afternoon years ago, not been quite enough to keep someone else alive alongside him. He didn't let himself think about that now. There would be time for that later, alone, the way there always was. Denise Holbrook would say, for months afterward, that she'd never in her life felt as helpless as she had in those first few seconds flames climbing out from under a hood not 30 feet from her son, her own feet frozen to the driveway, in a way that no amount of panic seemed able to unstick, until a voice she barely recognized as her own quiet neighbor's cut through the noise and told her exactly what to do. She would say, too, that what stayed with her longest wasn't the fire itself but the sight of Daniel afterward, soot-streaked and calm, kneeling in front of her boy, checking his hands and his face for burns with the gentle, thorough efficiency of someone who had checked far worse injuries on far worse days, speaking to him the whole time in a low, steady voice about how brave he'd been, how it was all over now, how his mom was right there and everything was fine. It was, she told Gary later, the single most reassuring thing she had ever watched another human being do, and she had spent 4 months believing rumors about that same man that she was now deeply ashamed of. Mia had come out onto their own porch by then, drawn by the noise, and Rosa Alvarez, moving faster than her 78 years usually allowed, had crossed her yard in her housecoat and gathered the little girl against her side before she could get any closer to the smoke. "Stay with me, mija," Rosa said, low and steady, and Mia, wide-eyed, stayed, watching her father move through the smoke and heat with a competence she had never once seen from him before. Not like this, not out loud, not where anyone could watch. Rosa Alvarez, watching from her own front window, would say later that in that moment, for just a few seconds, she saw the young soldier her own husband used to describe from his own war the version of a man that emergency strips everything else away to reveal. The fire department arrived 4 minutes later and had the blaze out in under 10. No one was hurt. The SUV was a total loss, but the house behind it and the children who'd been inside it were untouched, and everyone on the street would agree afterward that those 4 minutes before the trucks arrived had mattered more than anyone wanted to think too hard about. The fire captain, walking the scene afterward with a clipboard, found Daniel still standing near the scorched driveway, hose looped back over his shoulder, and asked him a few routine questions: who called it in, who was first on scene, whether anyone had been near the vehicle when it caught. When Daniel answered plainly and precisely, using the kind of clipped, organized language most civilians don't use under pressure, the captain paused and looked at him a little more closely. "You prior service?" he asked. "Long time ago," Daniel said. The captain nodded slowly, the particular nod of one person who has stood in bad situations recognizing another. "Didn't look like it was a long time ago, the way you moved out here," he said, and left it at that, and climbed back into his truck. By the time the street had quieted back down, engines pulled away, neighbors drifting back into their houses, the scorched husk of the SUV left steaming faintly in the Holbrook's driveway. Under a darkening sky, Daniel found himself abruptly, entirely alone, with the adrenaline draining out of him all at once, the way it always used to after something like that, leaving behind a shakiness in his hands he had to consciously will away before Mia noticed. He walked Mia back across the street, made her a grilled cheese she barely touched, because she was too busy retelling the story to anyone who would listen, and once she was finally, reluctantly asleep, he sat alone at his kitchen table with the lights off. The same way Rosa's husband used to sit alone in his own dark kitchen decades earlier, though Daniel didn't know that yet. He didn't sleep much that night. Not because of fear the fire itself hadn't frightened him, not really. Not in any way that touched the deeper fear he still carried from years earlier. What kept him up was something quieter and more complicated. The unfamiliar, unsettling sensation of having been seen, however briefly, by an entire street, doing the one thing he had spent years trying very hard to keep private. He lay in bed running through it, wondering whether the neighbors who'd watched him move through that smoke with such obvious trained competence would ask more questions now. Wondering whether Gary Holbrook, of all people, would be the one to finally ask the right one. He didn't have long to wonder. In the 2 days between the fire and Gary's knock on his door, Daniel found himself thinking, more than once, about the exact shape of the choice sitting in front of him. He could keep doing what he'd always done, accept the gratitude, let the street's opinion of him quietly improve on the strength of one dramatic afternoon, and go right on keeping the rest of himself locked in that box on the closet shelf, the way he had for 6 years. The way that had mostly worked, right up until it hadn't. Or he could do the thing Dr. Okafor had been gently pushing him toward for a year. The thing that felt, even now, like it went against every instinct he'd spent a career building. He didn't reach a decision. Not really. Not in any way he could have explained out loud. He simply found, when Gary actually showed up on his porch, looking smaller and more uncertain than Daniel had ever seen him, that the decision had somehow already been made somewhere underneath his conscious mind. The way the best decisions in his old life had always tended to be. Gary Holbrook got the call from his wife while he was still in a hotel conference room 3 states away, and what she told him, through tears, shook something loose in him that 4 months of easy jokes at Daniel Reyes's expense had never come close to touching. She told him about the smoke. About their son standing too close. About the quiet man from the end of the street who hadn't hesitated for even a second. Who'd moved like he'd trained his whole life for exactly that moment. Who probably saved their boy from something none of them wanted to imagine. Gary drove home that same night instead of waiting for the conference to end. He didn't sleep the whole drive. He showed up at Daniel's door the next morning, a little after 8, and Daniel, expecting maybe a delivery or Mia's friend from down the street, was surprised to find Gary Holbrook standing on his porch, hands shoved awkwardly in his jacket pockets, looking nothing like the loud, easy man who'd held up that field jacket at the block party 3 months earlier. "I wanted to say thank you," Gary said. And the words seemed to cost him something to get out, like they'd gotten stuck somewhere on the way from his chest to his mouth. "For my son. For all of it." Daniel nodded, quiet, the way he was quiet about most things. Anyone would have done the same, he said, which wasn't entirely true, and both men probably knew it. But it was the kind of thing you say when you don't want the moment to become bigger than it already is. Gary stood there a second longer than the conversation strictly required, and then, almost like he couldn't help himself, he said, "How'd you know what to do like that? I mean that fast?" And it was in that pause, in the space where Daniel might once again have said nothing at all, that something shifted. Maybe it was the 4 straight days he'd spent being quietly, unfairly suspected by half the street. Maybe it was the memory of his daughter's face in the kitchen doorway the night the police car sat outside their house. Maybe it was simply that Rosa Alvarez, standing on her own porch 2 houses down, caught his eye at exactly that moment and gave him a small, steady nod. The kind of nod that says, "I see you, and it's all right, you can let this one out." He had not planned to say yes to that question. He had planned, if anything, to give Gary the same 4 flat sentences he gave everyone, and let the man go back to his own driveway none the wiser. But standing there on his porch, with the memory of the police car still fresh, with his daughter's small voice from that night still echoing somewhere behind his ribs, Daniel found that the wall he'd spent years maintaining had a door in it after all, and for reasons he wouldn't fully understand until much later, this seemed to be the morning it was meant to open. "Come on in," Daniel said instead, and stepped back from the door. He led Gary through the living room, past the small shelf where Mia's school photos sat next to a picture of Claire that Daniel dusted every single Sunday without fail, and into the back bedroom that served as his office, where a single closet held the box he almost never opened. He took it down. He set it on the bed. and for the first time in longer than he could remember longer. Certainly, than he had ever done for anyone outside of a VA counselor's office. Daniel Reyes opened that box in front of another person and let him look inside. There was the field jacket, folded the way it had always been folded, sand still ground so deep into the fabric that decades wouldn't wash it clean. There was a photograph of a squad of young men in desert fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at a camera in a way that only very young men in very dangerous places ever quite managed to grin. Gary studied that photograph longer than Daniel expected him to, and asked, quietly, which one was him. Daniel pointed to a lean young man on the far left, barely recognizable at first glance as the quiet, steady figure who mowed his lawn in perfectly straight lines every Sunday, younger, leaner, a version of himself from a life that felt, some days, like it belonged to somebody else entirely. There was a folded flag, triangle tight, the kind given at funerals, and Gary's breath caught seeing it, understanding without being told exactly whose funeral it had come from. And there, in a small velvet case at the bottom of the box, was a medal on a purple ribbon, a heart cast in bronze, resting against faded satin that had gone soft with age. Gary Holbrook went very, very still. He had seen Purple Hearts before, in movies, in museum cases behind glass, in the kind of documentary he liked to quote from at parties without ever really understanding what the images inside them had cost the men who lived them. But he had never stood in a quiet bedroom and had one placed gently into his own hands by the man who'd earned it, and something about the weight of it genuinely lighter than he expected, and somehow heavier than anything he'd ever held froze him completely. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it slightly in the morning light coming through the blinds, and then he looked up at Daniel with an expression Daniel had never once seen on his face in 4 months of jokes and lawn commentary and easy, borrowed confidence. It was the look of a man realizing, all at once, that he had spent an entire summer performing bravery he had never once had to earn, in front of someone who had earned it and never once performed it. "The kid from Ohio," Gary said quietly, nodding at the folded flag. "That's him." "Marcus," Daniel said. It was the first time he had said that name out loud to anyone outside a counselor's office in almost 3 years, and it cost him something to say it. A visible, physical cost that Gary could see settle into his shoulders. 22. Wanted to open a garage back home, fix up old muscle cars. Used to talk about it constantly. Drove the rest of us half crazy with it, honestly. A small, involuntary smile crossed his face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. I think about that garage sometimes. Wonder what he would have built. About 11 miles outside a town I don't say out loud, Daniel said, quietly, looking at the medal rather than at Gary, the way people often look away from the thing they're finally saying for the first time. I wasn't the only one hit. I was the one who lived. He paused. There's a name on that flag I keep folded up. Kid from Ohio. 22 years old. I was pulling him back when the second one went off, and I still don't know some days whether I did him any good at all, because he didn't make it either way. That's the jacket you were holding up at the barbecue, Gary. That's what was in it, underneath all the sand. There is one call Daniel makes every single year, on a date in March that he has never once forgotten and never once needed to write down. He calls a woman in a small town in Ohio named Linda, who used to sign her letters to her son Mom in handwriting so similar to Marcus's own that the first time Daniel saw it, on a card that arrived overseas a month before the Eid, he'd had to sit with it for a while before he could bring himself to open it. Linda still asks him every year how he's doing, whether he's eating enough, whether that little girl of his is keeping him on his toes, and every year Daniel tells her the same small true things: that Mia lost her first tooth, that Mia made the honor roll, that Mia asked once, unprompted, whether she could write a letter to a soldier named Marcus that she'd never met. And Daniel had to explain, as gently as he knew how, why that particular letter couldn't be mailed anywhere at all. Linda never once, in 6 years of these calls, has asked Daniel for anything he wasn't ready to give. She has never asked him to describe the day itself. She only ever asks about the living, about Mia, about the garage Marcus never got to open, about whether Daniel still thinks, some nights, about the man her son might have grown into. It is, Daniel has come to understand, its own kind of grace, the specific grace of a mother who has decided that keeping the door open gently is worth more than ever trying to force it. He thought of her, standing in that back bedroom with Gary Holbrook holding the medal in his open hands, and found himself, for the first time, wanting someone other than Linda to understand even a small part of what that call every March actually cost him to make. He didn't go further than that, and Gary, to his credit, didn't ask him to. There are parts of that afternoon Daniel has never once described in full to anyone, not to Dr. Okafor. Not to the 2 other men from his unit he still calls on Marcus's birthday every year. Not to Claire, even, back when she was alive and he trusted her with almost everything else in his life. Some things aren't meant to become stories. They're meant to be carried, quietly, by the people who were there. And Daniel has made his peace, mostly, with being one of the people who carries that particular weight alone. What he could give Gary, what he decided that morning he was finally willing to give him, was enough to replace 4 months of easy jokes with something true. Enough to make sure his daughter never again had to watch a police car sit outside her own house, because a grown man couldn't be bothered to ask a real question before he started talking. The silence in that room stretched out long enough that Gary Holbrook, a man who had never in his adult life been at a loss for something loud and confident to say, found he had absolutely nothing. "I didn't know," he finally managed, and his voice had none of its usual booming certainty left in it at all. "I know you didn't," Daniel said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a tiredness that had been building for months, maybe years. That's kind of the point. You didn't know, and you talked like you did anyway. Whole Street's been treating me and my daughter different for 3 months because of jokes you made without ever once asking a single real question. Gary set the medal back into its case with hands that had gone visibly unsteady, and when he looked up at Daniel, something in his face had genuinely changed, not the sheepish, performative apology of a man caught being embarrassing at a party, but something closer to the particular shame of realizing you have spent months being cruel to exactly the kind of person you always claimed, loudly, at every backyard barbecue, to admire. "I'm sorry," he said, and it came out rough, unpolished, nothing like his usual easy confidence. "I'm genuinely sorry, Daniel, for the jacket. For all of it. I'll fix it. I don't know how yet, but I'll fix it." He didn't have to figure out how, not entirely on his own. Word moves through a cul-de-sac exactly as fast in the other direction once it's given a reason to, and within a week, Gary Holbrook, who had never in his life passed up an opportunity to talk loudly about something, was doing the one thing that actually mattered. Talking loudly, finally, about the truth. He told Renee, the mother who'd made the call to the police, exactly what he'd seen in that back bedroom. Exactly what kind of man they'd all spent a summer quietly suspecting. Renee showed up at Daniel's door 2 days later, mortified, holding a casserole dish like an offering, and stumbled through an apology that Daniel accepted with more grace than she felt she deserved. He told the other parents at the next school pickup, unprompted, red-faced with an honesty that cost him more than any joke ever had. And one by one, the small courtesies that had quietly vanished over the summer began, just as quietly, to return: a wave from a porch, an invitation to a birthday party, a phone call from Phil Osgood asking, sheepishly, whether Daniel might still be able to fit him in for his fall furnace tune-up. The boy who had cornered Mia by the monkey bars turned out, that same week, to be visiting his uncle again for the long weekend, and Gary, to his credit, and clearly still working through the fuller shape of his own summer of carelessness, sat the boy down and made him understand, in terms a 10-year-old could follow, exactly what kind of harm second-hand gossip could do when it landed on an 8-year-old girl who hadn't done anything wrong at all. The boy showed up at Daniel's front door 2 days later, marched there by his uncle, hands stuffed in his pockets, and mumbled an apology to Mia that was clearly rehearsed, and clearly, underneath the rehearsal, sincere Mia, with the particular grace children sometimes manage better than adults, accepted it without making him suffer for it, and even offered to show him the frog-catching spot by the drainage ditch sometime, which seemed to surprise the boy more than the apology had. The week before that gathering, Mrs. Whitfield's class held its usual Friday show and tell, and Mia, who had never once volunteered for it in 2 full months of school, raised her hand before anyone else could. She'd asked Daniel's permission first, the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework folder open in front of her, and a seriousness in her face that made him set down whatever he was doing and give her his full attention. "Can I tell them about the medal?" she'd asked. "Not the whole thing, just that you have one. I want them to know." Daniel had thought about it for a long moment, turning the request over the way he turned over most requests that touched that particular closet shelf, and then he'd nodded. "You can tell them what you know," he said. "You don't have to explain more than feels right to you." So on that Friday, Mia stood up in front of her second-grade class with nothing in her hands, no object to pass around the way everyone else usually did, and told them, in the plain, unadorned language of an 8-year-old, that her dad used to be a soldier, that he'd gotten hurt helping someone else, that he had a medal in a box in his closet that he almost never showed anybody, and that some people on their street had said mean things about him over the summer because they didn't know any of that yet. She said it without tears, without drama, the same way she'd once told off a 5th grader by the monkey bars, and when she sat back down, Mrs. Whitfield had to take a moment before she could move on to the next student. Gary organized, of all things, a proper Veterans Day gathering for the street that November. It wasn't much folding tables dragged out onto the little park by the maple tree, a borrowed sound system, a paper banner Mrs. Whitfield's own class had helped make after she'd quietly, without ever naming names, started a unit on community and respect that Daniel suspected wasn't entirely a coincidence. Somebody had strung a few strands of small flags between the maple's lower branches, and Mrs. Danby, unprompted, showed up with a second potato salad, as if the first one hadn't already been dreaded enough. Tom, Daniel's supervisor, showed up with a case of soda he hadn't been asked to bring, and pulled Daniel aside early on to tell him, gruffly, that Phil Osgood's call back in September had bothered him more than he'd let on at the time, and that he was glad it hadn't been the last word on the subject. Even Phil Osgood came, standing a little awkwardly at the back of the small crowd for most of the afternoon, before he finally worked up the nerve to cross over and find Daniel near the drinks table. He didn't make a speech out of it. He just said he was sorry, plainly, that he'd let a rumor push out 3 good years of a technician doing honest work in his house, and that he hoped Daniel would still take his call the next time the furnace acted up. Daniel told him he would, and meant it, because holding a grudge had never once, in his experience, made anybody's furnace run any better. Mrs. Whitfield came too, on her own time, on a Saturday, which Daniel understood without being told was not something teachers generally did for families they'd quietly worried about all semester. She found Mia before she found Daniel, crouched down to her level near the frog pond at the edge of the little park, and told her, in the careful, warm way she had, that she was proud of how Mia had stood up for her father back in September, and that she wanted her to know teachers make mistakes too, and that watching too closely, instead of asking a real question, had been one of hers. Gary stood up in front of the whole cul-de-sac to say, plainly, that he owed an apology to a neighbor who deserved a great deal better than what he'd gotten from all of them, and he didn't dress it up the way he dressed up most things. He told them about the jacket, about the jokes, about a phone call he'd gotten in a hotel conference room that had shown him, all at once, exactly what his son's life might have looked like without the quiet man at the end of the street. He didn't mention the medal directly that wasn't his to give away, but he said, voice rougher than anyone on that street had ever heard it, that some of the bravest people you'll ever meet are the ones who never once tell you about it, and that he was ashamed it had taken him this long to notice that the man he'd mocked all summer had been the strongest person on the block the entire time. Daniel didn't need the public apology. He would have been content, honestly, to simply let the whole thing quietly fade the way most misunderstandings do. But he stood there anyway, at the edge of that little park with the old maple tree, Mia's small hand tucked into his, and let the street see him for who he actually was, not because he owed anyone that explanation, but because his daughter was standing beside him, watching every neighbor who'd once looked at her strangely now look at her father with something closer to the truth. Rosa Alvarez stood near the front of that small crowd, arms crossed, watching it all with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had recognized something true a long time before anyone else on that street bothered to look closely enough to see it. She thought, watching Gary stumble through his rougher, unpolished sentences, that he reminded her a little of Roberto in the years just after he finally started talking again, a man discovering, somewhat to his own surprise, that honesty could be its own kind of relief, once you stopped being so afraid of what it might cost you. When Gary finished speaking, and the small crowd applauded, awkward and sincere in the way only a cul-de-sac gathering can be, Rosa made her way over to Daniel and took both his hands in hers, weathered and warm, and said nothing at all for a long moment, which was somehow exactly the right amount to say. Roberto would have liked you, she finally told him the first time in 6 years she had said her late husband's name to Daniel directly. He never talked about it either. Not once, in 40 years. I used to think it meant he didn't trust me enough. She squeezed his hands once, gently. It took me a long time to understand it wasn't about trust at all. It was just too heavy to hand to someone who loved him. He didn't want me carrying it too. Daniel didn't have an answer for that, not right away, but something about hearing it settled a question he hadn't fully known he was still asking himself. Later that evening, after the folding tables had been packed away and the paper banner taken down, and Mia had finally worn herself out running around the little park with Theo and half the other kids from the street, Daniel sat with her on their own front steps under a porch light he'd checked, out of habit, twice already that day. The night had gone properly cold, the first real cold of the season, and Mia had a blanket pulled around her shoulders and a hot chocolate going lukewarm in her hands. Everybody was being nice today, she said, after a while, in the careful, testing voice she used when she was working her way toward a bigger question. Yeah, Daniel said. They were. Was it because of the medal? She'd overheard enough, in the way kids always overhear everything, to have pieced together some rough version of the shape of it. The one in the box in your closet? Daniel thought about how to answer that for a while, the porch light humming faintly overhead, the street quiet, and settled around them the way it hadn't felt quiet and settled in months. Partly, he finally said. But mostly it was because I finally let somebody see it. That's usually the harder part, if I'm honest. Not the getting it, the letting people see. Mia, for her part, didn't fully understand every piece of what had happened that fall she was 8. And 8-year-olds understand fear and relief far more clearly than they understand nuance, but she understood enough. She understood that the bad feeling that had settled over their house for a while had finally lifted. She understood that the boy from down the street whose mother used to look at her strangely was now inexplicably asking if she wanted to come to his birthday party. Mia considered the question about the medal with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old turning over a genuinely adult idea for the first time. And then, sitting there on the front steps in the cold, she reached over without a word and drew one more small star on the back of his hand, right there under the porch light, in blue ballpoint pen carried out from the kitchen junk drawer specifically for the occasion. Daniel didn't wash it off that night. He still had a faint blue smudge of it on his skin 2 days later, and he found himself glancing down at it more than once, at odd moments pouring coffee at 5:40 in the morning, waiting in the drive-through line for one plain cheeseburger, no pickles, apple juice, and something in his chest would loosen just slightly every time he saw it. The jacket went back into its box, back onto the top shelf of the closet, folded the way it had always been folded. But something about that box felt different now. Lighter, somehow, though nothing in it weighed any less than it had all summer. Maybe it was only that for the first time in a long while, Daniel Reyes had let someone else hold a small piece of what he carried, and found that the carrying afterward felt just a little less like something he had to do entirely alone. He still doesn't talk about it much. Some nights are still hard, and some mornings still start with a memory instead of a sunrise, but he has noticed over the months since that the memory tends to loosen its grip a little faster than it used to, that the walk from the bad dream back to the ordinary morning takes a little less time now than it did the year before, and he thinks, though he has never said this out loud to anyone, that some part of that has to do with a box he no longer has to carry entirely alone. By the following spring, the street had settled into something that felt, to Daniel, almost unrecognizable from the summer before. Gary had taken to stopping by most Saturday mornings with his own travel mug of coffee, not to make jokes anymore, but simply to talk, haltingly at first and then more easily, about his father, about the silences he'd grown up trying and failing to fill, about a version of himself he was still in the slow process of becoming less afraid of. Daniel found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't mind the company. There was something almost restful about being understood, even partially, by a man who'd once understood him least of anyone on the block. Mrs. Whitfield's unit on community and respect became, unofficially, an annual tradition at the school, and the following November, when the second graders were asked to write about someone in their family they admired, half the class wrote about grandparents or older siblings, and Mia wrote 4 careful, misspelled paragraphs about her father that Daniel keeps, to this day, folded inside the same box on the top shelf of his closet, tucked in beside the flag and the photograph and the medal, because it turns out a box built to hold the hardest things a man carries has room, if you let it, for some of the best things too. Rosa Alvarez's garden came back that spring, tomatoes and all, with Daniel and Mia both out there most weekends helping her get the beds turned over. And the stubborn patch of mint that had once belonged to Roberto came back too, exactly as unmanageable as she'd described, and exactly as welcome. She still keeps his reading glasses in the nightstand drawer. She has never explained why, and nobody on that street has ever asked her to. Old Mr. Ferris finally got his scarecrow, the one Mia had been promising him since the fall before. Built at last from a spare flannel shirt and a floppy hat Rosa contributed, standing crooked and cheerful in his tomato patch through that whole next summer, and if anyone ever wondered, Later, what had become of the old field jacket that started the whole thing? The answer was simple enough. It never left that closet shelf again. Some things, once you finally let someone see them, don't need to be taken out and proven twice. But on quiet evenings now, if you walked down that cul-de-sac past the maple trees turning orange too early, you might see Gary Holbrook out on his own lawn, tossing a football with his son, and further down the street, an 8-year-old girl on a bicycle with one hand off the handlebars, showing off, while her father watches from the porch with a coffee mug that says "World's Okayest Fisherman" and a small blue star still faintly visible on the back of his hand, refusing, quietly, to fade all the way. Cut, cut, cut.